PANS PANDAS is a particularly important condition to me because I have a colleague whose daughter has PANS PANDAS diagnosis, and she has firsthand experienced parental blame and the threat of FII. And she came to me today and said, Kelly, I'm so glad that you're working with PANS PANDAS UK on this because it's so important. And the families who need the support in this area really need the support in this area. So it's just a real privilege to be asked to come and talk about this. Now, bit of an agenda. How I'm going to try to do the content part before we get to the Q&A is not too theory based, because I think actually when we've got limited time, strategies and resources are much more useful. But in getting to strategies and resources, we do need to know a little bit about what FII is, what FII is not, which is really important, and what the current climate is, and what things like what schools are being taught at the moment about FII, because I think probably the biggest battle, especially something like PANS PANDAS, which isn't widely known, there's pockets of knowledge, but there's a lot of professionals who've just never heard of it before. You know, what are schools being told that they've got to do around things like perplexing presentations, as opposed to, you know, what you guys are going through as families. So knowing that difference is a real sort of empowerment of knowledge, so that as you progress through, you know, perhaps getting diagnoses, or I really hope not, but maybe if you've had FII accusations leveled at you before, if you have that knowledge of sort of what goes on in the background and how we reach the point we're at, it will help you view everything that happens to you with a really useful lens that you might not have had before. And then what I'm hopefully going to be doing is ending on some really good strategies and resources and ideas for how you can communicate with professionals, particularly those in schools, and particularly those medical professionals as well, who might not actually know about PANS PANDAS, which is crazy when you think about it. Like, how can a medical professional not know? But my gosh, it happens. So Q&A, I'm going to try and leave a good whack of time for Q&A, at least 25 minutes if I can, because I think that will be the most valuable bit. If you want to sort of share with me a few of your stories and maybe get a take on that, that's absolutely fine. The only thing I can't do is go into a huge amount of detail about your individual cases, simply because FII cases are so different from one another, and it's all dependent on, you know, what the professionals are saying and doing, that you almost need quite a personalized approach. But I will honestly give you as much as I can that is useful to go away. So, like, where does parent blame start? Now, generally speaking, it is where professionals don't understand something about a child's presentation and therefore make an unfounded conclusion that the presentation comes from a different source other than what's within their knowledge. Now, I know it's crazy to imagine, but there's quite a lot of egos in professionals, and some of them that you may encounter don't understand certain things about presentations. And this leads to seeking of different reasons why, either through causation or fabrication. It can stem from as early and as low key as, well, we don't see that presentation in school. We don't see that presentation. They're fine in school. That's another one that pops up a lot. And we know very much that they are probably not fine at all. Particularly with PANS PANDAS, you do go in flares of this condition. And when in a flare, life changes. Your child becomes unrecognizable. And often in those situations, your child is significantly unwell and significantly less able to go to school. So logically, this creates a situation where the school see your child when they are not flaring, and they don't see them very much where they might be in a peak flare. So their conclusion then is, well, I don't see what the problem is. When you manage to get them to school, mum or dad, they're fine. I think you just need to be a bit firmer, don't you? I think you maybe need to just, you know, make home a bit less appealing and a bit more boring, don't you think? And it's like, well, no, not at all. We need to, you know, home is the greatest safeguard around my child. It's where they need to feel at most, you know, completely safe. And I'm not going to enforce, you know, these things on them, particularly when they're in a PANS or PANDAS flare, that will cause them active trauma and harm. And those conversations are really big conversations, particularly when you're talking about trauma and harm, that then professionals who don't get it go, gosh, what an exaggeration. And then we find ourselves tootling along this line of judgment and blame. Now, if you are at the moment within any sort of tiptoe into the water of feeling like there might be FII at stake here, please have a look at the research by Kathleen Long, Dr. Judy Eaton, Sally Russell, Fiona Gullen-Scott and Andy Bilson. And they published a really key piece of research in 2021. And it effectively demolishes the guidance that was out there in terms of FII. And it basically uses the words defective Department for Education guidance as a root cause of this problem, which is leading to parents being blamed when they ask for care for their disabled children instead of receiving the help and support they deserve. And this is a monumentally important piece of research, and it's one where you can draw upon numerous quotes if you need to, through sort of dealing with professionals who might be levelling FII at you. Now, this is really key to understand. FII is a term used by professionals to describe parents whose description of their child doesn't match that which is observed by professionals. And this is known as perplexing presentation. The child has a perplexing presentation. They present one way in one situation, another way in another situation, or professionals perceive there to be that difference. There's a lot of research that says that FII allegations are much more prevalent within the neurodivergent community. And this is because a lot of the time, neurotypical professionals are viewing this neurodivergent situation through a neurotypical lens and not through the lens of neurodivergence. It's a set of criteria, FII. What it is absolutely categorically not is a diagnosis. There is no research to even support its existence. If you go online and you just Google FII, the results will shock you, because there are reputable safeguarding training websites that conflate FII with the now historic terminology Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and what is sort of essentially replaced that terminology wide as factitious disease imposed upon another. There are safeguarding websites that train schools that say FII and factitious disease imposed upon another are the same thing. And this is fundamentally incorrect. FII is not a diagnosis. You can't be diagnosed with it. It's a series of criteria. And it's very worrying that that message is being put out and about. So here is a little case study that may be horribly familiar to you of where early signs of difficulty, particularly around things like school attendance, we find that to be probably the biggest trigger of FII allegations. It's oh, this previously very good attender suddenly can't attend. You know, what's going on? And the very quick leap is to that of confusion. That, well, they were attending and now they're not attending. You know, what's going on? What is happening at home? You know, are you being strong enough in making sure that they come to school? And by the time we get to sort of this red and blue zone, professionals who can't necessarily solve or reason why the problem is occurring then turn to a place of blame because they can't remedy it. And this, again, unfortunately, is particularly true in schools, where schools say, well, we've exhausted everything we can do, mum and dad. You know, we've given you a really good reintegration timetable that we've dreamt up out of our brain and not tried to understand your child about at all, but you still have to conform to it. Oh, no, you haven't conformed to it. It must be a you issue. Or the other type of professional is doctors. Doctors that you go and see and you say, look, have you heard of PANS PANDAS? You know, this is a real thing. it absolutely exists. And the terrifying truth is that there are some medical professionals out there who just aren't familiar with it at all. And again, they conflate it with conditions which historically have had a very stereotypical and outdated opinion-based response to, one of them being what was known as ME, which is chronic fatigue syndrome. That's another one where professionals who are meant to be completely knowledge-driven and unbiased have personal, outdated opinions about conditions which aren't right. And we're sort of seeing that in some sort of some medical professions around PANS PANDAS. Then what happens is that everything that has gone before then starts to be questioned. And this is the teal coloured one here. And where you get professionals who now view everything about that family with a question mark. And there's usually at that point a huge misunderstanding throughout all the stakeholders involved. And it can be very hard to get back from that point. And then you get things like referrals into social care. And at that point, if you're a parent who's experiencing that, you don't want to say anything anymore, because everything you've said so far has not helped. And you've sort of reflected back on it and you thought, actually, it's made everything worse, because like no one's listened, no one's understood, and now everyone's judging me. And when you get to the sort of social care proceedings type angle, everything can feel so terribly out of your control, because now you don't get a say in the same way that you did. And even presenting facts such as FII is not a condition, this is not a diagnosis, even presenting known facts like that can feel like an incredibly daunting and impossible prospect. And then that leads to you feeling very trapped as a family, and it leads to you feeling like you can't advocate for your child in the right way anymore. And as a parent, I've got 2 children. The thought of that being my situation is heartbreaking. So if you as families are going through that, it's just horrendous, and I'm so sorry for you. So this is the sort of theory behind what we know from our research about false allegations of FII. Schools are the highest instigators of these, with the NHS coming in sort of second and social care about the same. Family and other sources are significantly lower. And there's a reason why this is from schools, because there's a real current climate of a lack of direction and clarity and a lack of training. The understanding of what FII is completely differs across schools and local authorities and areas. Again, you look up things like this at different local authority websites and the messages are completely different. There's no cohesion. Some professionals have reported to us at Sunshine Support, and we train families, we train professionals, we train schools. Some report that they're actually being told to spot and report FII, rather than being trained to be responsive to safeguarding issues in general. Responding to a child who has PANS PANDAS and is in a flare in a really prescriptive way is in itself a safeguarding issue, because you're going to cause more trauma and upset to the family and the child if you treat this as a, oh, something strange is going on situation, rather than a, I need to help you with your welfare situation. Perfect example of this is welfare checks. School have to do welfare checks on children who are persistently absent. This is right, because children do slip through the net, and serious case reviews have shown that. How you do your welfare check is the question. So whilst the school has an obligation to fulfill in terms of making sure that there's eyes on children, does it have to be their eyes? Does it have to be done in a really prescriptive, trauma triggering way for your child who currently is not like themselves at all because they're in the middle of a PANS flare? And if we don't think about things in terms of welfare, we are safeguarding a child's welfare. If we don't think about it like that, if we just think about it as we're suspicious, then the welfare side of stuff is just lost. We're not looking after welfare anymore. We're just all about suspicion and blame. There is an increasing number of children who are finding it harder to be educated in school, and this may be considered a safeguarding risk if their needs are not being met. And that has been particularly true since COVID. I think it's really important to make the point that whilst attendance difficulties have increased since COVID, COVID itself, or like being at home for ages, isn't the driver of that. In my view, if you are an undiagnosed neurodivergent individual and you suddenly don't have to go to school for a year, so your mask comes off in your safest, most secure place, it is very difficult to put that mask back on and just waltz back into school like nothing has happened. And that's where we're seeing a lot more neurodivergence come out since COVID, where it was just impossible for young people to do that. And we know about misinformation, so many misconceptions. There's a lack of FII research, which is further perpetuated by high-profile training websites. So these are genuine misconceptions that I have found online. In the UK, there's been a shift towards earlier recognition of possible fabricated or induced illness. So this means that professionals are actively looking out for it rather than looking at the whole picture in front of them. As professionals working with children and young people daily, education staff are in a prime position, are they, to identify inconsistencies in what they're being told about the child's needs versus how their child is presenting. Why are education staff in a prime position? Yes, okay, school is one part of their life, but as I've said, particularly with PANS PANDAS, it may not be that they even see the child at their most challenged during those periods of difficulty. How does that make them the prime position to support a family there? I'm not sure. If you have concerns that a child or victim of fabricated or induced illness, a referral should be made to the local authority. You should not seek parental consent before a strategy meeting because this may heighten the risks to the child. Well, that one speaks for itself, really. I'm a designated safeguarding lead at Sunshine Support, and I have been as a head teacher as well. It is true that if you have genuine safeguarding concerns, then you don't necessarily go to the parent. But what this is being sort of contextualized specifically within FII is if you have concerns that a child is a victim of fabricated or induced illness, make a referral. Well, if you don't know what FII is to start with, and you're being trained that it's something completely different to what it is, and you're being encouraged to just make referrals willy-nilly, we wonder why so many families are impacted by these false accusations that don't then just go away. You might be able to expunge them in some way from your record after a period of time. You might get corrections to your record where, if you're lucky, someone gives you an apology, but what doesn't go away is the lasting trauma. And that's the bit that's important more than anything else. Finally, there's little information about the prevalence of perplexing presentations and fabricated or induced illness, but it is believed there may be unreported cases because there's not necessarily a clear-cut pattern of instance. So they're basically there. That website is essentially acknowledging that there's not a lot known about it, but then is encouraging the thought process that this means there's FII lurking around every corner, that you have to be careful of this danger that might be there because no one knows enough about it. That's such a warped way of thinking. You've got to think, well, actually, there's not enough known about it, so why don't we educate ourselves about it to avoid this lasting trauma for families? Education settings are well placed to notice prolonged or frequent absence. Parents or carers involved in fabricated or induced illness may seek support and attention from their child's setting. I think that this is genuinely on a website about safeguarding against FII. As parents watching this webinar now with children with a really complex presentation, the concept that asking for help is a feature of FII is completely incorrect and wrong because it puts people off from asking for help and equally looking suspicious. Contrary to normal professional relationships with parents, being challenging about suspicions from the start may scare off a parent. Scare off, this is genuine terminology that I've downloaded from these places, thus making it more difficult to gain evidence. There may also be an unintended consequence in increasing the harmful behaviour in an attempt to be convincing. That isn't even FII. Harmful behaviour to another is factitious disease imposed upon another. That's not a criteria of FII. And the concept that you should almost be beguiling and you know, untrustworthy in bringing a parent into your fold in case challenging them makes them retreat and the problem worse is terrifying to read as a parent, yet this is what's being trained in schools and other organisations. And then here's an example of where the terminology is completely incorrect. This is a leading safeguarding website for head teachers, describes FII as a condition, and it says what once was referred to as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, it's now recommend the use of terms including medically unexplained symptoms, perplexing presentation, and fabricated or induced illness. It is not that, and that is a leading website for head teachers. This is where that ongoing recent research by Dr. 𝘗𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬 Scott and her team is really, really key. So here's where we get to the practical resources bit. So you know what schools are being taught about FII so that you can use that in your arsenal. So basically, schools have a duty to train all staff in safeguarding. Within that, there is no specific requirement to teach about FII, as there is with other particular safeguarding issues. For example, female genital mutilation, there's a requirement to teach about that specifically within safeguarding. There's not one about FII, yet people are being told to look for FII. Every school has designated safeguarding professionals who are particularly trained in responding and reporting. We're all encouraged to view safeguarding as a jigsaw puzzle, so nothing in isolation, everything sort of brought together to see an overall picture, and that all professionals are responsible for safeguarding. So you don't have to be a DSL, a designated safeguarding lead, to report or sort of give your concerns in. There's a key document which I encourage everybody to read if you haven't already, Keeping Children Safe in Education, also known as 𝘗𝘰𝘵𝘬𝘬𝘬, you might have heard it referred to. The main document is 2023, but there's been an update since then. And it doesn't say a great deal about FII, to be honest. It just talks about it under the definition of physical abuse, and that's it. And there's only under one reference to FII in that whole document, which is a link to another piece of government document called Working Together to Safeguard Children, which also mentions the word fabricated 0 times. So we're talking in these completely misaligned concepts. But I would definitely upskill yourself in this document and also Working Together to Safeguard Children. So this leads to the conclusion that FII is completely misreported, undertrained, and it leads to a lack of understanding of what it is and how schools are supported to understand their role in identifying when it happens. So educators are told that if you've got a feeling that a risk of harm is the child is at risk of harm, you must make an urgent referral to police, children's social care, generally via something called MASH, which is a multi-agency safeguarding hub. Every local authority has that or equivalent under a different name, as a case of likely significant harm due to suspected or actual harm. These are big words. This should lead to a strategy meeting, and the safety of siblings also needs to be considered. Got to document concerns carefully in a safeguarding record and consider whether the child needs immediate protection and measures taken to reduce immediate risk. And this, of course, leads to where we're at with why a neurodivergent parent or a parent of PANS PANDAS child may live in fear to fight for their child. Because this is what we're being told. I'm going to not linger on this slide too much because you're going to have access to all the slides after, and I want to make sure I've left enough time. But the last paragraph is particularly galling. Severely disrupted due to medical appointments or having days off due to being unwell. Cases often identify that the abuser can be highly manipulative, frequently well informed about the different features of the illness, meaning that they're hard to challenge. For PANS PANDAS, this is a particularly big fear because it's not as well known as other conditions. If you take something like, I don't know, a neurodevelopmental condition such as ADHD, everyone's heard of it, everyone knows, well, they think they know how it presents. Even medical conditions, you know, if somebody has an identifiable medical issue, like, oh, she fell down, she broke her leg, and then she needs 3-4 weeks off school. Does anyone bat an eyelid at that? Absolutely not. And then you take PANS PANDAS, where you've got a child who, generally speaking, and I know this isn't a consistent presentation of PANS and PANDAS, But one of the features that there's some commonality is a very sudden sort of incidence of it. And I know that that's not for everybody, and other people have had a more gradual experience, but sudden can be a feature, and this can be really hard for professionals to understand. So where you as a parent have done all your research into understanding your child who's in significant distress, you try and tell that professional, you are then painted as here as frequently well informed about the different features of the illness, and that you're manipulative. No, you're not. You're advocating for your child in the right way. So people who are from neurodivergent and disabled families are much more likely to be accused. They are often triggered by complaints. So if you come across a professional who, you're expecting to understand what PANS PANDAS actually is, and they don't have a clue, and then you complain, believe it or not, over 50% of FII cases were brought on the parent after they complained about the relevant public body. So again, this is a huge part of that research by Dr. Fiona Gullen-Scott and her team that points towards just a complete almost conspiracy of, I've tried to advocate for my child and I've complained because I was dealt with really poorly, and their answer to the complaint is then to say it's me. And another thing that's often levelled at pushbacks on FII is that the alerting signs of FII are not supported by any peer-reviewed research at all. So it requires a complete overhaul in light of all the research that's out there. So this is how I want you to sort of consider how to deal with accusations of FII. So the first thing is that if the school or other professionals want to explore things like welfare checks and safeguarding, it's good to be as accommodating as possible without compromising the well-being of your child. So no one is ever suggesting or should suggest that a professional should withhold genuine safeguarding concerns for fear of making an incorrect allegation. Instead, as a parent, you can acknowledge how difficult it is for schools and other professionals to be in a situation where the presentation is indeed quite perplexing of the young person. And I have a little phrase that I use a lot: curiosity, not conflict. And sometimes when we're in the midst of just awful times, a really bad flare, or you just can't get through to the school, sometimes we can feel incredibly frustrated by that. And our pushback is defense. And actually what our pushback needs to be is downplaying of ourselves a little bit and a bit of curiosity. So a perfect example of this would be if you saw a doctor and you talked through all your concerns and you felt like you were really heard and validated, and then the clinic letter that comes out of that is completely misrepresentative of everything that you thought was discussed. One of the most dangerous approaches in that situation, if you're feeling like there's FII lurking around, is to go in cross and say, this is wrong, I really need to complain about this, you've deliberately misrepresented me. Because egos in professionals, they'll often turn around and they'll be like, I feel attacked, I'm going to push back on this, it must be the parent being mad. Actually, a lot of the time, a rubbish clinic letter is because the GP is really overworked and hasn't given enough time and thought to it. But that, of course, doesn't matter, not in the long run, if you need that to be evidence. So I always recommend going in with curiosity and sort of painting yourself as, slightly confused. Doctor, I'm just really confused by this letter. Now, I find it really hard to process things in the moment when we're talking about my child, because it's really hard for us as a family. So one of the strategies I've adopted for myself is to write things down after I've had meetings, just so I don't forget them. And I can revisit my notes after. And I'm just really curious to get your view as to whether my notes might help in making the letter a bit more detailed for school, so that school can understand things more. Because this letter that I've got, it doesn't reflect my notes, and I'm worried I've misinterpreted something and written it down wrong. Please, can you help me? Please, can you help me? And I'm just curious about are two really good phrases, because if you think about it in logical terms, I don't know. If you think about a child in distress, I was talking to a school about this the other day, about behaviours that challenge and behaviours that are communication sort of strategies. I said to the school, it's a lot harder to be empathetic when you have a child who's causing destruction to property. And it's a lot more straightforward to be empathetic to a child who is described as having a panic attack or is being anxious. We want to put our arm around those children, whereas the children who are causing damage often get physically restrained. And that is a huge difference, whereas in fact the driver of the behaviour is likely to be very, very similar. So as a parent in this situation, you want to try to encourage professionals to want to put an arm around you rather than conflict with you. So please help me understand. Oh, please, you know, I'm curious about this. I just would love to know more. Painting the expert as the real knowledgeable person can just help that sort of relationship. FII is incredibly rare, far rarer than reports actually suggest, because over 80% of FII reports were found to be unfounded, and over 95% of children remained with their parents. These are all really, really key things to be alerting professionals about, but in a way that doesn't come across as conflicting or challenging of their view, but comes across as curious. So I'm really curious to know, you know, how, if you're using fabricated or induced illness, how rare is that? Because to me, this doesn't align with our family, and I'm just help me understand why you feel that this is something that is relevant to us and our family. And equally, whilst this isn't one so much for parents, but it's one to just think about in terms of the whole process of everything, schools must have access to much better safeguarding supervision and training as well. I'm going to skip through a couple of slides just for you to have for your own sort of reference about masking, because often in our PANS PANDAS children, we do see a little bit of masking at school, particularly in terms of how they're feeling, and compartmentalizing school and home is very, very different. And there's quite a lot of useful information on those slides. I'm just really mindful about leaving enough time for questions from you all. So yes, so supporting parents who've asked for help is really key if you're a school, and this is something that you can use in your sort of wheelhouse of resources when you're talking to schools, to paint yourself as the person who they need to wrap her arm around, as in a person who's in conflict. So painting yourself as a person that's taken a lot to ask for help because you're really appreciative of what the school are doing. You know that they're incredibly overworked, but you just need help in determining the way forward. And one of the best things that I've seen schools and parents do when they work together is for a parent to come in and say, hey, look, school, we're not expecting you to have all the answers. Okay, me coming to you and saying my child is really struggling to attend, they have these flares, their personality just is completely different to what they are like normally. There's OCD behaviours at home, there's aggression, they're not sleeping through the night, they're in such distress. I don't know what's going on as their parent. I'm not expecting you as a school to know. I don't want you to give me answers. What I want from you as a school or as a doctor is to respond and say, hey, gosh, that must be really hard. Whilst we might not see it in school, we understand that why that might be. And we appreciate you saying that you don't think that we have answers, because I don't think we do. But how about we try and learn together? We go on this journey together. And if you can lead with that as a parent, lead by example, to say, no one has answers. We don't have answers. You don't have answers. Can we just be curious together rather than judgmental? And we're all here for the good of the young person. Like no teacher or doctor goes to work every day, I hope, and thinks, oh yeah, let's ruin a few children's lives today. Everyone wants to be there to look after young people, and trying to lead by that example of, hey, we're a team, is really, really key.